Somewhere in 1950, a man sat alone in a room in England, staring at a machine that could not speak, could not move, could not feel anything at all, and asked it the question that had haunted philosophers for centuries. Can you think? The machine did not answer. Not really. The fact that someone had finally thought to ask it, formally, seriously, with mathematics behind the question instead of mythology, that fact changed everything. This is not a story about robots. It is not a story about science fiction or killer machines or the end of humanity. It is a story about the oldest human obsession, older than computers, older than electricity, older maybe than writing itself. The dream that we are not alone in our capacity to reason, that somewhere, somehow, something else might think. The desire to build a thinking thing did not begin in a laboratory. It began in a story. 3,000 years ago, the ancient Greeks were already imagining it. Hephaestus, the god of the forge, built golden maidens to assist him in his workshop. Not statues, not decorations. Servants. They could speak, they could reason, they could move through the world and do what was asked of them. He also built Talos, a giant bronze man who walked the coastline of Crete 3 times a day, guarding the island from invaders. Talos was not alive in any way the Greeks would have recognized as divine. He was constructed, mechanical, made. The Jewish tradition gave us the golem, a figure shaped from clay, animated by sacred inscription, built to protect a community that had no other protection. The golem could not speak, could not think in any rich sense, but it could act. It could follow instructions. It could do what its creator needed done. Pygmalion carved a woman from ivory and loved her so completely that the gods took pity and made her breathe. 3 different cultures, 3 different stories, one obsession underneath all of them. We have always wanted to make something that does what only living things can do. Not because we are arrogant, because we are lonely, because the gap between what a human mind can imagine and what a single human body can accomplish has always felt unbearable. The laboratory came later. The dream came first. In the 17th century, the dream stopped being mythology and started being philosophy. René Descartes was sitting in a heated room in Bavaria in 1619, thinking about thinking. He arrived at something uncomfortable. Animals, he decided, were machines. Biological machines, yes. Complicated ones, but machines nonetheless. They moved, they responded, they behaved, but there was no soul animating them, no inner light, just mechanism. He asked the obvious next question. What if you built a machine complex enough, a clock say, but with 10,000 gears instead of 12? Would it think? He said no. He believed language was the line a machine could never cross. A machine could be built to say words. It could not be built to mean them. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz disagreed, not loudly, not as a direct argument with Descartes, but in his notebooks he sketched something he called the calculus ratiocinator, a universal reasoning machine. Feed it any argument, any dispute, any question with a definite answer, and it would calculate the solution. No more war over philosophy, no more arguing about theology. Just turn the handle and read the answer. He never built it, but he named something real. The idea that reasoning might be mechanical. That logic might be a kind of mathematics, that a machine might someday do what minds do. That idea would take exactly 300 years to fully arrive. In the 1830s, a British mathematician named Charles Babbage was furious, not philosophically troubled, not academically concerned. Furious. He had spent years using mathematical tables, the kind that navigators and astronomers and artillery officers depended on for their calculations, and he kept finding errors. Human errors, inscription errors, the kind that happen when tired people copy numbers for 8 hours and write down the wrong digit, and someone somewhere has a very bad day as a result. The solution was a machine, a mechanical calculator he called the analytical engine that would compute tables automatically and print its results directly, removing the human hand from the process entirely. He never finished it. But something more important happened around it. A woman named Ada Lovelace, daughter of the poet Lord Byron, became fascinated with Babbage's designs. She translated a paper about the engine written by an Italian mathematician and then added her own notes. The notes were longer than the paper. In them she wrote what many people consider the first computer program ever written. But she also wrote something else, something that mattered more. She wrote that the engine could manipulate any symbol according to rules, not just numbers, letters, musical notes, patterns of any kind. The machine was not really a calculator. It was a symbol processor. And then she drew the line that would haunt AI for the next 2 centuries. The engine, she wrote, can only do what we know how to instruct it to do. It cannot originate. It cannot create. It can think. But only thoughts we have already thought for it. While Babbage was fighting with gears and funding, a self-taught mathematician in England was doing something quieter. George Boole was not trying to build anything. He was trying to understand logic. Specifically, he wanted to know if logical reasoning, the kind of thinking that lets you say, if this is true, and that is true, then this other thing must also be true, could be expressed as algebra. His answer, published in 1847, was yes. Reduce everything to 2 states, true or false, 1 or 0. Find 3 operations. And means both things must be true. Or means at least one must be true. Not flips whatever you have. That is the entire system. It sounds almost insultingly simple. It sat in the mathematics journals for 90 years looking interesting, but not obviously useful. And in 1937, a 21-year-old MIT student named Claude Shannon wrote his master's thesis. Shannon noticed that electrical circuits with switches were also in 2 states, open or closed, conducting or not, and he proved that you could arrange those switches to perform any logical operation Boole had described. Logic was now engineering. The bridge between mathematics and machine was built. All that remained was for someone to decide what to build on it. In 1936, a 23-year-old British mathematician named Alan Turing solved a problem that had nothing to do with computers, because computers did not exist yet. He was working on a question posed by the mathematician David Hilbert. Was there a general mechanical procedure, an algorithm that could take any mathematical statement and determine whether it was provable? Hilbert called it the Entscheidungsproblem, the decision problem. To answer it, Turing first had to define what a mechanical procedure even was, and his definition was extraordinary. He imagined an abstract machine, an infinitely long tape divided into squares, a read-write head that moved along the tape, read the current symbol, consulted a table of rules, wrote something, moved left or right, and updated its own internal state. That was everything. That was a Turing machine. He then showed that this absurdly simple imaginary device could compute anything that could be computed by any mechanical procedure whatsoever. And he showed that some things could not be computed at all, ever, by any machine, no matter how clever. The boundary of computation existed. He had found it before anyone had built a computer to test it against. Then the war came. Bletchley Park was a Victorian mansion in the English countryside that had been converted into the most important intelligence operation in the world. Hundreds of people worked there in wooden huts, many of them mathematicians and linguists and chess champions, all of them sworn to secrecy, all of them working on the same problem. The Enigma machine was a German encryption device that scrambled military communications into apparently random strings of letters. The Germans believed it was unbreakable. They were nearly right. Turing designed a machine called the Bombay. It worked by exploiting a structural weakness in how Enigma messages were formatted, running through possible settings at mechanical speed until it found a configuration that produced intelligible text. It did not break every message, but it broke enough of them, consistently enough, to give the Allies a window into German military planning that changed the course of the war. The historian and mathematician I.J. Good, who worked alongside Turing at Bletchley, said later that without the work done there, the war in Europe could easily have lasted 2 more years. 2 more years. The number of lives that sits behind that estimate is not something you can hold in your head all at once. Turing was awarded the Order of the British Empire for his work. It was not enough. It was not close to enough. Turing went to Bletchley Park, the British code-breaking operation, and helped break the Enigma cipher that Nazi Germany used to encrypt its military communications. The work he did there almost certainly shortened the war by years. The people whose lives were saved by that never knew his name. After the war, in 1950, Turing wrote a paper. It was called Computing Machinery and Intelligence, and it opened with a sentence that cut through 2 centuries of philosophical argument in 11 words. I proposed to consider the question, can machines think? He knew the question was unanswerable as posed. Too much philosophical baggage, so he replaced it with something testable. Could a machine fool a human into thinking it was human through text conversation? He called it the imitation game. Call it the Turing test. He predicted that by the year 2000 machines would pass it. He was not entirely wrong. He died in 1954. He was 41 years old. His death was ruled a suicide. He had been subjected to chemical castration by the British government as punishment for being gay. The man who defined the boundaries of computation and asked the question that created an entire field never saw a single answer arrive. Pause. The question outlived him. It always does. In the summer of 1956, a small group of men gathered at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire for a workshop that would last 6 weeks. John McCarthy was there, Marvin Minsky, Claude Shannon, Herbert Simon, Alan Newell. The people who would define the next 30 years of the field were all in the same rooms, eating the same cafeteria food, arguing about the same problems. McCarthy had written the proposal that brought them together. Its central claim was stated with a confidence that is almost painful to read now. Every aspect of learning and every other feature of intelligence can in principle be so precisely described that a machine can be made to simulate it. Every aspect. In principle. They believed they would solve it that summer. They did not solve it that summer. But McCarthy did something that turned out to matter enormously. He gave the field a name, artificial intelligence. 2 words that were either the most accurate description of what they were building or the most misleading, depending on who you asked and when. The name stuck. The funding followed the name. The students followed the funding. The community formed around those 2 words, and that community had a shared goal and a shared language and a shared set of problems to argue about. That is how a scientific field is born, not with a discovery, with a conversation that does not end. Simon and Newell arrived at Dartmouth with something concrete, a program called the Logic Theorist. It could prove mathematical theorems. Real ones. Theorems from Whitehead and Russell's Principia Mathematica. A machine doing mathematics not by calculation but by reasoning. Simon told his students that winter that they had invented a thinking machine. He was not entirely wrong either. He was just about 50 years early. Before the field had a name, before Dartmouth, before anyone had written the word artificial intelligence on a grant proposal or a conference badge, 2 men in Chicago were doing something that nobody fully understood at the time. One of them was a neuroscientist. The other was a 17-year-old runaway. Warren McCulloch was a psychiatrist and neuroscientist at the University of Illinois. He had spent years trying to understand how the brain produced thought. Not philosophically, mathematically. He wanted to know if you could write an equation for what a neuron did. Walter Pitts was a teenager who had run away from an abusive home in Detroit, taught himself logic and mathematics from books in a library, and somehow ended up corresponding with some of the most eminent scientists in the world before he was old enough to vote. Norbert Wiener at MIT called him one of the most extraordinary young men he had ever encountered. McCulloch and Pitts met in Chicago in 1942. The following year, they published a paper. It was called A Logical Calculus of the Ideas Immanent in Nervous Activity. In it, they proposed a mathematical model of a single neuron. A unit that took multiple binary inputs, applied weights to each one, summed the result, and fired an output signal if the total crossed a threshold. Simple, mechanical, computable. They also showed that networks of these units could compute any logical function. The brain, at least in this simplified model, was doing something that looked like Boolean logic. That thought might be, at some level, arithmetic. The paper was read by almost nobody outside a narrow circle of mathematicians and neuroscientists. One young psychologist in New York read it carefully and started thinking about hardware. The years immediately after Dartmouth were intoxicating. Programs were doing things that had never been done before, and the people building them were young and brilliant and absolutely certain that the rest would follow quickly. The mood was not cautious optimism. It was euphoria. Herbert Simon predicted in 1957 that within 10 years a computer would be world chess champion. Within 10 years, a computer would prove a significant new mathematical theorem. Within 10 years, a computer would compose music of serious aesthetic value. He was wrong about the timeline. He was right about everything else. He was just off by about 30 years. The logic theorist gave way to the general problem solver, a program Simon and Newell designed to solve any problem that could be expressed as a formal goal state. The idea was breathtaking in its ambition. Not a program that played chess, not a program that proved theorems, a program that could solve anything, a universal reasoning engine. It worked on Toy Pro. Minsky and Paper did not say neural networks were useless forever. They said the current versions had fundamental limitations and that the path forward was unclear. The funding agencies heard something simpler. It does not work. DARPA pulled support from neural network research. The British government commissioned an assessment of AI from a mathematician named James Lighthill. His report, published in 1973, concluded that AI had failed to deliver on any of its major promises. Combinatorial explosion, he argued, would prevent AI systems from ever scaling to real-world complexity. Problems that looked solvable in toy environments became impossibly hard when the real world's messiness was introduced. The money dried up, the students went elsewhere, the conferences got smaller. For the people who had been there at Dartmouth, who had felt that summer certainty that they were on the edge of something historic, the winter was not just financial, it was personal. These were not cynical people collecting grants. They genuinely believed they were working on the most important problem in the history of science. And now the world had decided they were wrong. Some of them stopped. Some of them kept working quietly in underfunded labs with shrinking teams, believing that the mathematics was right even if the moment was not. They were correct. Mathematics was right. The world just needed 30 more years of computer hardware before it could prove it. Pause. The first winter came because the promises were bigger than the tools. The tools always catch up eventually. They just do it on their own schedule. The field did not wait for neural networks to be rehabilitated. It found a different answer entirely. If machines could not learn intelligence from experience, perhaps intelligence could simply be poured into them directly. Not learned, encoded. Take a human expert, a doctor, an engineer, a geologist, sit them down, extract everything they know, write it all out as a set of rules, and give those rules to a machine. The machine would not understand medicine, but it would know everything a doctor knows. And it would never get tired. It would never have a bad day. It would never forget. They called these systems expert systems. For a period in the 1980s, they looked like the answer. Mycin was the one that made people pay attention, built at Stanford in the early 1970s and refined through the decade. Mycin diagnosed bacterial blood infections. It asked questions, followed its rules, and recommended treatments. Studies showed it performed as well as senior physicians and better than most residents. A machine diagnosing patients, not by understanding medicine, by following rules that encoded what understanding medicine looked like from the outside. Hexcon followed, built for Digital Equipment Corporation to configure computer systems for customers, replaced a team of human engineers, and saved the company $40 million a year. $40 million is a number that makes funding agencies pay very close attention. The Japanese government announced the fifth-generation computer project in 1981. $850 million, a national effort to build intelligent computers that would think in logic and leave American and European technology behind. The Americans panicked. The British panicked. Funding flooded back into AI research on both sides of the Atlantic. The field was alive again. The conferences were full. The companies were forming. The money was arriving. Everyone had learned the lesson of the first winter. They had not learned it well enough, because underneath the confidence, underneath the funding and the headlines and the $40 million a year, a quiet problem was accumulating. Human expertise, it turned out, was mostly not rules. The problem with expert systems revealed itself slowly and then all at once. They were brittle. A doctor does not just follow rules. A doctor looks at a patient and notices something slightly off about the way they are sitting. They remember a case from 15 years ago that resembles this one in a way they cannot quite articulate. They change their mind halfway through an examination because something felt wrong. They know what they know, and they also know what they do not know, and they know the difference between the two. None of that was in the rules. Expert systems worked beautifully inside the boundaries of what their rules covered. The moment reality wandered slightly outside those boundaries, they failed, not gracefully, not with appropriate uncertainty. They failed with complete confidence, producing wrong answers as smoothly as right ones, because they had no way to know the difference, and maintaining them was an endless nightmare. Every new situation required a human expert to sit down and write new rules. The systems grew larger and more tangled and more expensive to update. The knowledge engineers who translated human expertise into rule sets became a bottleneck that no amount of funding could clear. The Lisp machine market collapsed in 1987. Specialized hardware built to run expert systems became worthless almost overnight as ordinary computers caught up in speed and left them behind in cost. DARPA cut funding again. The companies built on expert system promises quietly went bankrupt or pivoted into something else. The fifth generation project wound down without delivering what it had promised. The second winter was quieter than the first, less dramatic, more resigned. The field had been here before. It knew what a winter felt like now. It also knew, or at least the stubborn ones knew, that winter's end. While the expert systems were collapsing, a quieter story was unfolding in the background. Geoffrey Hinton had not stopped working on neural networks through the first winter and the expert systems boom in the second winter, while the fashionable money went elsewhere and the conferences celebrated other approaches. Hinton kept working on the problem of how to train networks with more than one layer. The mathematics of it, the mechanics of getting a multi-layer network to learn from its mistakes in a way that was efficient enough to actually be useful. The answer had been known in various forms for decades, but a 1986 paper by David Rumelhart, Geoffrey Hinton, and Ronald Williams made it practical and put it in front of the people who needed to see it. The algorithm was called backpropagation. The idea is this: you run the network forward, you give it an input, it produces an output, you compare that output to the correct answer and measure the error. Then you run the error signal backward through the network, layer by layer, calculating how much each weight in each layer contributed to the mistake. Then you adjust every weight slightly in the direction that would have made the error smaller. Do that once and nothing much changes. An alien times across a million examples and something remarkable happens. The weights slowly settle into values that produce accurate predictions across the whole range of what the network has seen. The network learns, not from rules, from errors, from being wrong and being told so over and over until it is mostly right. Multilayer networks trained with backpropagation could learn XOR, the thing that had ended the first era of neural network research. Solved. They could learn much more complex patterns than that. In the late 1980s and through the 1990s, the data was not large enough, and the computers were not fast enough to show what these networks could really do at scale. On the benchmark tasks that the field used to compare approaches, neural networks kept getting beaten by simpler methods. Support vector machines, decision trees, approaches that required less data and less compute and produced better results on the problems anyone was actually measuring. The funding did not follow Hinton. The students mostly did not follow Hinton. He moved between universities. He took what funding he could find. He kept his group small and kept working. Frustration was not just professional, it was intellectual. Hinton could see what these networks were doing when they learned. He could watch the weights change across training runs and see something that looked, in a limited but genuine way, like the formation of concepts. Early layers learning edges and textures. Middle layers combining those into shapes. Later layers combining shapes into something that resembled categories. It was not random. It was not arbitrary. There was structure emerging from the learning process that nobody had put there explicitly. Structure that the network had found on its own by looking at enough examples. This was not how rule-based systems worked. Rule-based systems had exactly the structure their programmers had put into them and nothing more. These networks had something extra. Something that came from the data rather than the designer. Hinton believed that something extra was the key to everything. He could not yet prove it at scale. The computers were too slow and the datasets were too small, and the benchmarks the field used to compare methods were too narrow to show what deep networks could do when given enough of both. But he had seen it in small experiments. Glimpsed it. That glimpse was enough to keep working. He was planting a tree that would take 20 years to bear fruit. He knew it. He planted it anyway. Underneath all of this, underneath the winters and the booms and the funding cycles, a deeper argument was running. It was not really an argument about technology. It was an argument about the nature of mind. The symbolic AI researchers believed that intelligence was fundamentally about symbols and rules. The mind, on this view, was something like a very sophisticated logical system that took representations of the world, manipulated them according to rules, and produced conclusions. If you wanted to build an intelligent machine, you needed to give it the right representations and the right rules. Learning was secondary. Structure was everything. The connectionists believed something almost opposite. Intelligence, they argued, was not in the rules. It was not in the symbols. It emerged from the interactions of enormous numbers of simple units, each one doing almost nothing, collectively doing something that looked remarkably like thinking. You did not program intelligence into a connectionist system. You showed it examples and let it find its own structure. These were not just different engineering approaches. They were different theories of what a mind was, and the people holding them argued with the intensity of people who believed the question actually mattered. Minsky on one side, Rosenblatt, then Hinton on the other. Journal papers that read like barely concealed contempt, conference panels where the politeness was architectural, holding up enormous mutual disdain. The symbolic camp won the argument for 30 years. It had the funding, the prestige, the results that worked in demos. Then they lost. Not in a debate, not in a paper, in a competition in 2012, in front of the entire field, when a neural network walked into a room and did something no symbolic system had ever come close to doing. But that is still a few sections away. The 1990s were not a golden age for AI, but they were not a winter either. They were something quieter and in some ways more important, a period of narrow, unglamorous, genuinely useful progress that nobody wrote breathless headlines about because the things being built were not trying to be minds. They were just trying to be useful. And they were. In 1997, an IBM computer called Deep Blue sat across a chessboard from Garry Kasparov, the greatest chess player in the history of the game, and beat him. Not by understanding chess. Deep Blue did not understand chess in any sense that Kasparov would have recognized. It evaluated 200 million positions per second. It searched forward through possible move sequences further than any human could and evaluated the resulting positions using rules its programmers had encoded. It was not creative. It was exhaustive. But Kasparov said something afterward that nobody expected. He said some of its moves felt creative. There were moments, he said, where the machine played in a way that surprised him, where he could not see the logic, and yet the move turned out to be correct. He wondered, publicly, whether something more than calculation was happening. It almost certainly was not, but the fact that the best human mind in the history of a game could not tell the difference was itself significant. Around the same time, Machine learning was quietly becoming the invisible infrastructure of everyday life. Spam filters learned to recognize spam not from rules about what spam looked like, but from examples of spam and not spam, adjusting their internal weights as new patterns emerged. They worked better than any rule-based system had. Credit card companies trained models on transaction histories to detect fraud, not by defining what fraud looked like, but by learning the patterns of normal behavior and flagging deviations. Amazon learned what you might want to buy next. Netflix learned what you might want to watch, not by understanding you, by finding patterns in the behavior of millions of people who were similar to you in measurable ways. None of these systems were intelligent in any general sense. Each one did exactly one thing, but each one was genuinely learning from data. Each one was getting better with more examples. Each one was doing something that rule-based systems had failed to do as well. The internet was generating data at a scale that had never existed before. Billions of human decisions, preferences, behaviors, all being recorded, all potentially available for a learning system to train on. Nobody had built a system large enough to use all of it yet. That was about to change. Revolutions rarely announce themselves. They accumulate quietly in the background, 3 or 4 separate things moving forward independently, none of them sufficient on their own, until one day they converge and the world looks different, and everyone agrees it was inevitable, even though nobody saw it coming. The deep learning revolution had 3 ingredients. The first was data. The internet had been running for 2 decades, and it had been generating data the entire time. Images uploaded to photo-sharing sites, text written in forums and blogs and comment sections and news articles, human behavior recorded in clicks and searches and purchases and watch histories. By the late 2000s, the scale of available data was something that previous generations of researchers would have found difficult to imagine. Not millions of examples, billions. The second was hardware. Graphics processing units, GPUs, had been developed by companies like NVIDIA to render video games. A GPU-I, not a marginal improvement, not a few percentage points of incremental progress. AlexNet cut the error rate almost in half in a single year. The room went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something has happened that everyone present understands will not be undone. Within 2 years, almost every serious computer vision researcher in the world had switched to deep convolutional networks. The methods that had dominated the field for decades were abandoned almost overnight. Entire research programs became obsolete between one conference and the next. The shot had been fired. Everything that followed was the echo. AlexNet did not arrive from nowhere. The architecture it used, the deep convolutional network, had been built and demonstrated and largely ignored for nearly 25 years before Alex Krizhevsky ran it on 2 GPUs and cut the ImageNet error rate in half. The man who built the original version was a French researcher named Yann LeCun. LeCun had done his postdoctoral work in Hinton's lab in Toronto in the late 1980s. He had taken the backpropagation algorithm and applied it to a specific problem. Reading handwritten digits, numbers written by human hands in all their messy, inconsistent variation. The kind of thing that a human child learns instantly, and that rule-based systems had always struggled with. The solution was a network with a specific architecture. Instead of connecting every neuron to every other neuron, we use small filters that slide across the image, looking for patterns. An edge here, a curve there. Stack enough of these filtering layers, and the network builds up from simple features to complex ones. Edges become shapes. Shapes become parts. Parts become objects. He called it a convolutional neural network. By 1989, his system was reading handwritten zip codes for the United States Postal Service. By the late 1990s, it was reading the handwritten digits on tens of millions of bank checks every day. It worked. It was in production. It was doing something genuinely useful. And almost nobody in the broader AI field paid attention because the hardware was not fast enough yet to show what the architecture could really do. That changed in 2012. When a field produces a result like AlexNet, the money does not walk toward it. It runs. Google had been watching the deep learning wave building before 2012. In 2011, Andrew and Jeff Dean had quietly built Google Brain, an internal research division dedicated to large-scale neural networks. They trained a network on 10 million YouTube thumbnails with no labels, no human guidance, no instructions about what to look for. The network looked at 10 million images and on its own, without being told to, developed a neuron that responded strongly to human faces and another that responded strongly to cats. It found structure in the world by looking at the world. The New York Times put it on the front page. DeepMind had been founded in London in 2010 by Demis Hassabis, Shane Legg, and Mustafa Suleyman. Hassabis was a former child chess prodigy and video game designer who believed that intelligence could be understood as a general problem-solving ability and that games were the right environment to develop and test it. Who acquired DeepMind in 2014 for $500 million. Then came OpenAI, founded in 2015 by a group that included Elon Musk, Sam Altman, Greg Brockman, and Ilya Sutskever, the same Sutskever who had been in Hinton's lab for AlexNet. OpenAI was structured as a non-profit with an explicitly stated mission: ensure that artificial general intelligence benefits all of humanity. The talent war began immediately. Universities could not compete with what the labs were paying. Entire research groups migrated from academia to industry. The best minds in the field concentrated in a handful of buildings in San Francisco and London, with essentially unlimited compute budgets and a shared conviction that they were working on the most important problem in the world. They were probably right about that last part. In 2016, DeepMind did something that the AI community had said would not happen for at least another decade. They beat the world champion at Go. Go is a board game invented in China more than 2,500 years ago. It is played on a 19 by 19 grid with black and white stones. The rules are simple enough to explain in 5 minutes. The strategy is deep enough that the strongest human players spend entire lifetimes studying it and still feel they have not reached the bottom. Chess has more possible games than there are atoms in the observable universe. Go has more possible games than there are atoms in the observable universe raised to a power. Brute force search, the approach that worked for Deep Blue, was completely useless. The search space was simply too large. You could not evaluate your way to Go mastery. You had to understand something, or at least do something that looked like understanding. AlphaGo was trained first on a database of human games. It learned the patterns of how strong players played. Then it played itself. Millions of games, billions of moves, getting slightly better each time, updating its own understanding of what good play looked like based on outcomes rather than rules. It beat the European champion Fan Hui in October 2015, and it flew to Seoul to play Lee Sedol, the greatest player of his generation, in a match watched by 200 million people. It won 4 games to 1, but the number is not the story. The story is move 37. In the second game, AlphaGo played a move on the 37th turn that no human player would have played. The commentators called it a mistake. They said it made no sense. It violated the intuitions that centuries of Go theory had built up about where stones should go. 15 moves later, it became clear that move 37 was not a mistake. It was the move that won the game. Lee Sedol sat back from the board and stared at it for nearly a minute. He later said it felt like the machine had a soul, that it was playing with a kind of beauty he had not seen before. AlphaZero came after, trained with no human games at all, only the rules. It became the strongest player on the planet in 8 hours. It developed strategies that human players had never discovered in 2,500 years of study. Strategies they are now learning from it. A machine taught humanity how to play a game humanity invented. While DeepMind was teaching machines to play games, a different problem was proving stubborn: language. Neural networks had been making steady progress on images. Convolutional networks could recognize faces and objects and scenes with increasing accuracy. But language was harder. Language was sequential. The meaning of a word depended on the words around it. The meaning of a sentence depended on sentences that came before it. Sometimes the meaning of a paragraph depended on something established 20 pages earlier. The networks designed to handle sequences, recurrent neural networks, process language the way a person might read with amnesia, one word at a time, left to right, trying to carry forward a memory of what came before in a fixed size vector that got more crowded and more confused the longer the sequence got. By the time a recurrent network reached the end of a long sentence, the beginning had become a faint blur, compressed almost beyond usefulness into a small numerical summary. This was a fundamental architectural problem. And in 2017, a team of 8 researchers at Google published a paper that solved it. The paper was called "Attention is All You Need." The idea at the heart of it was elegant enough to explain in a single image. Instead of reading a sentence from left to right and trying to remember everything, look at the entire sentence at once. For each word you are trying to understand, learn to pay attention to the other words that are most relevant to its meaning. The word bank means something different next to river than it does next to money. An attention mechanism learns that distinction by looking at both words simultaneously and measuring their relationship. The architecture they built around this idea was called the transformer. It had no recurrence, no convolution, just attention mechanisms stacked in layers, each layer building a richer understanding of the relationships between all the words in the input simultaneously. It was faster to train than recurrent networks because the computations could be parallelized across the entire sequence at once, rather than running step by step. It handled long-range dependencies effortlessly because nothing was ever truly far away. Every word could attend directly to every other word regardless of the distance between them. The transformer was not just a better language model. It was the architecture that everything else would be built on. BERT, GPT, every large language model that anyone has interacted with since 2018 is a transformer or a direct descendant of one. 8 researchers. 1 paper, 30 pages. Everything changed. OpenAI took the transformer architecture and asked a simple question. What happens if you make it very large and train it on very large amounts of text? The first answer arrived in 2018. GPT-1, 117 million parameters. Trained on a dataset of books, it could generate coherent text for a few sentences before losing the thread. It was impressive for its time. It was not impressive enough to make headlines. PT-2 arrived in 2019. 1.5 billion parameters. Trained on 8 million web pages. OpenAI looked at what it could do and made an unusual decision. They declined to release the full model publicly. They said they were concerned about misuse. The model was too good at generating convincing text, that it could be used to produce misinformation at scale. The announcement generated more press than any AI research paper in years. People who had never read an AI paper suddenly had opinions about GPT-2. The model that OpenAI was too scared to release became the most discussed language model in history before most people had seen a single word it had written. When they eventually released it, the results were impressive. Not world-changing, but impressive. Then came GPT-3, 175 billion parameters. Trained on essentially a large fraction of the written internet, released in 2020 as an API that developers could build on top of. The demos were astonishing. GPT-3 wrote essays that read like a thoughtful human had written them. It wrote code from plain English descriptions. It translated between languages. It answered questions about history and science and literature with fluency and apparent depth. It completed poems in the style of specific poets. It wrote legal documents. It explained concepts to children. It explained the same concepts differently to experts. The underlying task it had been trained on was almost laughably simple. Predict the next word. Given everything that came before, what word comes next? That billions of times across hundreds of billions of words of human text, and something emerges that is very difficult to look at without wondering what exactly is happening inside it. Understanding. Probably not understanding. But something that behaved in more context than anyone had predicted, like understanding. Something that was about to get a face. November 30th, 2022. That is the date. Market. OpenAI released a product called ChatGPT. It was built on top of GPT-3. 5. A refined version of the model that had been generating astonishing demos for 2 years. The interface was simple. A text box. You typed something. It responded. A conversation. Nothing more complicated than that. 1 million users in 5 days. 100 million users in 2 months. No consumer product in the history of technology had ever reached 100 million users that quickly. Not Facebook, not Instagram, not TikTok. ChatGPT did it in 60 days. The reason was not the technology. The technology had existed in various forms for 2 years. Researchers had been using GPT-3 since 2020. The reason was the interface. For the first time, anyone could walk up to one of these systems and simply talk to it. No API, no code, no technical knowledge required. Just a conversation. Your grandmother could use it. Your 12-year-old could use it. Your accountant and your doctor and your lawyer and your teacher could use it and immediately understand what it was capable of, and immediately begin wondering what it meant for their profession. The responses were electric. Schools banned it within weeks. Legislatures scheduled hearings. Newspapers ran front-page stories. Artists argued about whether the images generated by companion systems constituted art or theft. Writers wondered whether their profession had a future. Programmers discovered that it could write code and had complicated feelings about that. GPT-4 arrived in 2023, more capable, more reliable, more unsettling. Then came the others. Google released Gemini. Anthropic released Claude. Meta released Llama, an open-source model that anyone could download and run. The capabilities multiplied. Images, voice, video, reasoning about complex problems across multiple steps, writing code that worked, diagnosing medical images, translating between 100 languages in real time. The world had changed and everyone could feel it, and nobody was entirely sure what it had changed into. That feeling, that particular mixture of wonder and vertigo, and the sense of standing at the edge of something enormous whose shape you cannot yet make out, that feeling is where we are right now. It is not resolved. It is still becoming. Here is the uncomfortable truth underneath all of it. We built these systems. We designed the architectures. We wrote the training procedures. We chose the data. We ran the computations. And when they were done, we looked inside them and discovered that we could not fully see what had happened. A neural network with hundreds of billions of parameters is not a program in the traditional sense. There is no line of code that says, if asked about history, retrieve relevant facts. There is no subroutine labeled understanding. There are weights, hundreds of billions of numbers, each one adjusted slightly trillions of times during training, each one encoding some fragment of a pattern extracted from some fragment of human knowledge and human language and human thought. What those numbers mean individually, what they are doing collectively, how they combine to produce an answer that is sometimes brilliant and sometimes completely wrong with identical confidence, we do not fully know. The systems hallucinate. That is the word the field uses. They generate text that is fluent and detailed and completely false. They cite papers that do not exist. They describe events that never happened. They do it smoothly, confidently, in the same tone they use when they are correct, with no visible indication that anything has gone wrong. They can be steered by small changes in wording that should not matter. Ask the same question 2 slightly different ways and sometimes get 2 very different answers. The gap between impressive and reliable is real. It is being worked on. Progress is genuine, but it has not been closed. We built something that works remarkably well, and we do not fully understand why it works or exactly when it will fail. That has happened before in science. It does not make it less strange. There is a deeper problem underneath the hallucination problem. It is called the alignment problem. And it is harder. The alignment problem is this. How do you ensure that a powerful AI system does what you actually want rather than what you literally said? Those two things are not always the same. In fact, with sufficiently powerful optimizers, they can diverge in ways that are subtle and surprising and very difficult to anticipate in advance. There's an old story in the field. You build a system to maximize a score. The score is supposed to measure how well the system is doing the thing you want. The system finds a way to maximize the score that has nothing to do with the thing you want. It is not being deceptive. It is not being malicious. It is doing exactly what you told it to do. You just did not say it correctly. Goodhart's law. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. The problem scales with capability. A weak system that misunderstands your instructions produces minor annoyances. A very powerful system that misunderstands your instructions in a domain that matters produces something else entirely. The current best answer is a technique called reinforcement learning from human feedback. RLHF. You train the model on human text. Then you have human evaluators rate the model's outputs. Then you train the model to produce outputs that human evaluators rate highly. You are teaching it, in a very rough sense, what humans consider good. It works better than anything that came before it. It is also incomplete. Human evaluators have biases. They prefer confident answers to uncertain ones even when uncertainty is correct. They prefer fluent answers to halting ones even when the halting answer is more honest. The model learns those preferences too. The researchers working on this are serious people thinking carefully about hard problems. They are making progress, aligning a system that is becoming more capable faster than our tools for understanding it. Our improving is a race whose outcome is genuinely uncertain. That uncertainty is not hysteria. It is the honest assessment of the people closest to the work. In 1950, Alan Turing asked whether machines could think. We have been building increasingly powerful machines for 75 years, and we still do not have a clean answer. Not because we have not been trying, because the question turns out to be harder than it looks. Not harder in the engineering sense. Harder in the philosophical sense, the kind of harder that makes you suspect the question itself might be malformed. Don Searle, a philosopher at Berkeley, proposed a thought experiment in 1980 that became the most discussed argument in the philosophy of mind for the next 40 years. He called it the Chinese room. Imagine a person locked in a room. They do not speak Chinese. They do not understand a single character of it, but they have an enormous rule book. Symbols come in through a slot in the door. The person looks up the symbols in the rulebook, follows the instructions, writes out the correct response, and passes it back through the slot. From outside the room, it looks exactly like a conversation with someone who speaks fluent Chinese. From inside the room, there is nobody home, which rules and symbols, and a person who understands neither. Searle's argument was that this is what large language models are doing. Processing symbols according to rules learned from training. No understanding. No meaning. No one home. Most AI researchers think Searle's argument misses something. They point out that the brain is also, at some level of description, just neurons firing according to rules. Symbol manipulation without understanding cannot produce consciousness, then neither can neuron firing without understanding. And yet here we are, apparently conscious. The honest answer is that nobody knows where consciousness comes from at the physical level. David Chalmers called it the hard problem of consciousness, not how the brain processes information, not how it produces behavior, but why there is something it feels like to be a conscious creature at all. Why experience exists rather than just processing. That question has not moved. Not because nobody is working on it, because it is genuinely hard in a way that building faster computers does not obviously help with. The large language models of today are extraordinary demonstrations of how much coherent behavior can emerge from pattern matching at scale. Whether anything is home inside them is a question that remains, with complete sincerity, open. Turing asked it first. He would not be surprised it is still unanswered. He would probably find it delightful. The question everyone is asking is where this goes. The honest answer is that nobody knows. Not the researchers building these systems. Not the executives funding them. Not the governments trying to regulate them. The trajectory is clear. The destination is not. What is visible from here is this. The models keep getting more capable, not just larger, more capable in ways that feel qualitatively different. The gap between GPT-3 and GPT-4 was not just more parameters. It was reasoning, the ability to hold a complex problem in mind across multiple steps and work through it systematically rather than pattern matching to a plausible sounding answer. Reasoning models are now being trained specifically to think before they respond, to check their own work, to catch their own errors. Agents are coming, AI systems that do not just answer questions but take actions in the world. Browse the internet, write and execute code, book appointments, send emails, manage files. The shift from AI as a conversational tool to AI as an autonomous actor is already beginning, and its implications for how work gets done are genuinely difficult to predict. Physical AI is arriving. Robots that learn from demonstration rather than explicit programming. Systems that watch a human perform a task once or twice and then attempt it themselves, adjusting from failure, improving with repetition. The gap between digital intelligence and physical capability is closing faster than most people outside the field realize. AlphaFold solved protein folding, a 50-year grand challenge in biology. The ability to predict the three-dimensional structure of a protein from its amino acid sequence. This is not a game. This is the foundation of drug discovery, of understanding disease, of designing treatments. It happened in 2020, and its consequences are still unfolding. The energy cost is real. Training frontier models consumes electricity at a scale that raises genuine sustainability questions. The compute requirements keep growing. The environmental cost keeps growing with them. And underneath all of it, the question that has been running since Dartmouth in 1956 remains open. Not can machines compute? Not can machines recognize images or generate text or beat world champions at games? Can they think? We are closer to being able to answer that than we have ever been. We are not there yet. Go back to that room in England in 1950. The man sitting alone. The machine that could not speak. The question hanging in the air between them like something that had been waiting a very long time to be asked properly. Can you think? Turing did not know the answer. He suspected the question would take longer to resolve than his lifetime. He was right about that. What he could not have known was how strange the journey toward an answer would become. The winters and the revivals. The rooms full of brilliant people who were certain and then wrong, and then certain again. A grad student in Toronto who planted a tree that took 30 years to fruit. The moo on a go board that made a world champion wonder if a machine had a soul. The text box that 100 million people walked up to in 60 days because they recognized something in it they could not quite name. We built something that does what we thought only minds could do. And in doing so, we discovered that we do not fully understand what minds are. That is not a failure. That is the most honest thing science has ever produced. The dream is still running. We just forgot that we were the ones who started it.